Unraveling the mystery of modal verbs for advice. Hello learners! Today, we are going to talk about a fascinating topic in English grammar, modal verbs for advice. These verbs are extremely useful as they enable us to express our suggestions, recommendations, or pieces of advice in an effective manner. So, let's dive in and demystify these powerful verbs. Modal verbs are auxiliary verbs that express necessity, possibility, permission, and of course, advice. They are unique as they do not change their form according to tense or subject. Some common modal verbs include can, could, may, might, will, would, shall, should, must, and ought to. When it comes to advice, the three modal verbs we primarily use are should, ought to, and had better. These verbs express different degrees of advice, suggestions, and warnings. 1. Should. This is the most common modal verb for giving advice. It suggests that an action is the best course to take but does not imply any urgency or obligation. For example, you should eat more fruits and vegetables. 2. Ought to. This modal verb is almost identical to should in terms of advice, but it is less commonly used, especially in American English. For example, you ought to read more books. 3. Had better. This verb is used to give advice about specific situations, often when there is a sense of urgency or a potential negative consequence if the advice isn't followed. For example, you had better leave now, or you'll miss your train. Modal verbs are unique because they do not change form for different tenses. Instead, we alter the verb following the modal verb. To give advice in the past, we can use should have plus past participle or ought to have plus past participle. For example, you should have studied harder for the test. For advice about the future, we can simply use should, ought to, or had better with the base form of the verb. For example, you should start studying for the next test now. And there you have it, an overview of modal verbs for advice in English. The more you practice, the more natural it will become to use these verbs correctly and confidently. So, my advice? Practice, practice, practice. Keep honing your skills, and soon you will be a pro at giving advice using modal verbs in English. We hope this video has been helpful to you in your language learning journey. Until next time, happy learning!